If you and I are asked to control certain types of traffic, but only during certain times of the day, it's a cinch with Checkpoint. And in this hands-on lab, I'll walk you through how to do it. And it boils down to two basic things. Number one, we're going to create time objects that refer to the time that we either want to permit or deny certain types of traffic. And then we're simply going to include those time objects as conditions as part of our rules in our security policy. So here from our client computer, we'll go ahead and launch Smart Console. We'll log in as admin, supplying the lab password to connect to our manager at .110 and click Login. So here on the Security Policies tab, let's go ahead and create a couple new objects. And there's a few ways of doing that. One is to click over on the right. We can click on the Objects tab, and that brings up the Objects bar. And from here, we could create some new time objects. So there's a few already created for us, and we can create a new time object by simply clicking on New right here. So let's click on New. And from the drop-down, we'll hover over More. And then from the submenu, we'll go ahead and hover over Time. And then from here, we can simply select Time to create a new time object. So we'll click on Time. And for this first object, we'll call it 0 to 12. That it should start immediately and never end. And for the time range, let's specify midnight, which is 00:00 to 12:00. And then we'll click on OK. And here on the objects bar, we now have 4 time objects, 3 that came by default, the one we just created. Let's create one more to go from noon all the way to midnight. So we'll click on New once again in the Objects bar. From the submenu, we'll hover over More. From the next submenu, we'll hover over Time. And then once again, we'll click on Time to create our second time object. And we'll call this one 12 to 24. And for the time range for this bad boy, we'll specify that it starts at noon and goes all the way to 23:59, which is really close to midnight. And with that in place, we'll go ahead and click OK. So if we're done with the Objects bar, we can simply click on the Objects tab right here again, and that'll collapse that for us. So to use the time objects, we could create a brand new rule that includes time as a condition of a match, or we could add a time object as a condition of one of our existing rules. In fact, let's do that. Let's take rule number 3 right here, which is currently allowing traffic sourced from the inside going to the outside if it's DNS, HTTP, or HTTPS, and it's allowing that, and time isn't one of the considerations. So let's do this as a check. Before we make changes, let's go ahead and just verify that we really can do an HTTPS session from a device on the inside, like our management PC, over to some other device. And Firewall 2 and the web interface there can be a great test. So let's minimize Smart Console. And I've got a shortcut over here on the desktop for a web user interface for Firewall 2. So we'll click on that just to verify that it works. And that looks great. That's the login to Firewall 2 at Firewall 2's address. So we'll go ahead and close that. We'll hover near the bottom of our window and bring back Smart Console. And if we click on Rule 3 and refresh the Logs tab, oh, I see nothing here. And that is because, check this out, Rule number 1 is where that got caught. Because they're processed in order from top to bottom. And sure enough, our HTTPS from our management PC going to Firewall 2 would have been matched on Rule number 1. So that's great news as a baseline of where we want to apply this for a test. So also what I want to do here for rule number 1, let's also go ahead and modify tracking. So in the track column for rule number 1, let's go ahead and add log. We'll click on publish, and then we'll install that policy over on Firewall 1. So with Firewall 1 selected, we'll click on install and give that just a few moments to complete. Fantastic. So the policy has been implemented. Let's go ahead and try that again just to get a baseline of what normal looks like. So here's the shortcut for web user interface for Firewall 2. That is working. Great. We'll go ahead and close that. We'll go back to Smart Console. Now here in Smart Console with rule number 1 selected and the Logs tab selected, if we click on refresh here, we should now have some entries. So our management PC going over to the firewall using HTTPS, and here it says it's rule number 1 where that got picked up. Super. So let's make rule number 1 conditional based on time as well. Now to do that, to integrate our time object, we're going to right click on this title bar here for the policy, and as far as columns we want to see, we're going to put a check right here next to time so that it shows up in the interface. So here it is right here, and what we'll do is regarding time, instead of saying any, we'll click on the plus symbol, and then we can go ahead and grab our time objects, and I'm going to click on the plus next to both of them just to put them both in. And once we publish and apply this policy, rule number 1 would read as follows. If traffic is from the management IP address going to either firewall 1 or firewall 2 and is any of these protocols, then we're going to permit that traffic if it's between 0 and noon or noon and midnight. Now, one of the challenges with this lab that I thought of was that as you work on this lab, the labs are in one time zone and you and I may be in different time zones. So how could we test this? And I think the answer to that would be we can replicate this rule and just have one of the rules work for 0 to 12 and the other rule work for 12 to 24. So to replicate a rule, we can simply right-click on rule number 1. From the drop-down, select Copy, and then right-click on that rule again. And then for the paste, we can paste above or below the existing rule. So I'm going to paste below the existing rule, which will be our new rule number 2. And there it is. And then we can just modify the time conditions for each of these. So if we want rule number 1 to have just 0 through 12, we can go ahead and right-click on the 12 through 24. And from the drop-down, simply select Remove. And for the second rule, we can remove the 0 through 12 simply by clicking on it, then right-clicking and selecting Remove. Also, with these objects that are used as part of the policy, we can grab an object like this time object and just drag it over if you want to include it in another rule. So because we don't actually want the 12 to 24 in rule number 1, we'll right-click on that again and simply remove it from that rule. So once we publish and install this policy, rule number 1 will be matched if the system believes it's midnight through noon. And if it's not, that rule won't be applied and it'll go down to rule number 2, where if it's noon through midnight, rule number 2 will match. So let's go ahead and publish this. And we'll also click on Install Policy and confirm that with another install and give that a moment to complete. And it is successful. Fantastic. So now let's go ahead and minimize Smart Console and we'll launch our shortcut here to Firewall 2. And it's going to work because either rule 1 or rule 2 is going to hit. So we'll close that. We'll go back to Smart Console. And we can take a look. So I'm going to select rule number 1, click on the Logs tab, click on Refresh, and then I'm going to go to rule number 2 and click on Refresh. And there's no hits on rule number 2. For another test, if you want, we can actually reverse these. We could go ahead and put 12 to 24 here and 0 to 12 on the rule number 2. And then remove the ones that we don't need in those policies. So from rule number 1, I'm going to remove the 0 through 12. And for rule number 2, I'm going to remove the 12 through 24. Another option that we also could do is we could just drag and drop these rules to change the order, and that would work as well. So if we click on rule 2 and drag it up, it's now rule 1. Or if we take rule number 1 and we drag it down, now it's rule 2 instead of rule 1. So the bottom line is this. If the system thinks it is, in when I'm doing this lab right now, that it's around 3 a.m., and we publish and install this policy, it's going to be the new rule number 2 that's going to be hit that matches that traffic. And we can verify that by publishing our changes and then clicking on Install Policy and click on Install again and then give that a moment or two to complete. Fantastic. And now that that's done, we'll go ahead and minimize Smart Console. We'll launch our browser shortcut to Firewall 2 again. That continues to work. Great news. We'll close that. Let's go back to Smart Console. And with Rule 2 selected, we'll click on Refresh on the Logs tab. So here we have the updated timestamps for the activity that just happened, and it's also now showing that this was matched on Rule 2, which is this bad boy right there. And that's because rule number 1 wasn't a match because the time, when I did this lab, was around 3 a.m., which didn't match this time object, so rule number 1 was bypassed, and I went to rule number 2, which was a match because of the time, and as a result, that's why it was permitted. And we could double click on any one of these down here to take a closer look at the details of that logged event. In this nugget, we've created and applied time-based objects to be used as part of our security policy. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.